Hello, and welcome to Partially Redacted, a podcast where we discuss privacy and security engineering and related topics. I'm your host, Sean Falconer, and today I'm joined by Sam Sternberg, Customer Programs Lead at Skyflow, and we'll be talking about security and privacy at scale. Sam, welcome to the show.
Sean, it's an honor to be here. Happy to be your guest.
Yeah, thanks for being here and for our first ever video version of Partially Redacted, so that's exciting.
Lucky me.
So I know a little bit about your background. You've worked for, several, fairly large companies, companies like Meta, where you were TPM, and you were at Accenture before that. So we're going to get into a bunch of your sort of, background and history with working with, really large organizations. But before we get there, let's start with some basics. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So, just to start from the beginning, I did my undergrad at George Washington University in DC, studied computer science for both bachelor's and master's. I actually focused on computer security. I did my senior project actually on, it was something I invented called the Universal Mailing Address System. And it was a mail privacy and confidentiality system for the US Post Office. I actually pitched this on a random webinar that I found online. Still waiting for the callback, but privacy minded from the jump. After college, I actually worked for the federal government. I was a systems engineer, Active Directory administrator. I worked on physical server to virtual server migrations, kind of a 5-tool role there. And then, as you mentioned, I jumped into the consulting world. With Accenture. I was there for over 7 years, working within the identity and access management security space. I then went to Meta, and now I'm here at Skyflow, leading our customer programs team in the Americas, and also focusing on, enterprise strategic implementations and making sure that they go well with all of the complexities that come with the enterprise world. So I've been a customer, I've been a consultant, and now I'm in the product space. And I've seen all facets of how implementations can go well and some not so well.
Awesome. Yeah. I think you have the right background, both for a startup and for this conversation. You have a sort of wide breadth of experience and expertise that we can tap into, and of course is super helpful at any company that's trying to be a scale up because you're going to wear a lot of hats essentially.
Yeah, totally. And you can't forget the startup hat as you get bigger into the enterprise world. There are a lot of things that you need to aim for, even if idealistically within the bigger enterprise space that can pay back, can have benefits.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, we're talking about large enterprise, and throughout the history of the show, we've covered a lot of different topics. We've never really kind of dove specifically into these like sort of gigantic companies and what things look like from purely from their perspective, because things just get really, really complicated, both like operationally, because there's a lot of teams involved, and then also from a technical side of just like the infrastructure is complicated. So can you kind of like paint a picture for what infrastructure at one of these gigantic companies might look like? Like how many sort of like databases, servers, like people involved are we talking about?
Yeah. So at any given, on any given program, there could be hundreds of people involved, maybe thousands or tens of thousands of databases or servers, but it's less the quantity and more, the cross-functional nature of the folks involved, the distributed systems that are involved, other projects that are going on while your priority number one project, every project is priority number one, is going on in parallel, right? So if we think about a data security program, that could be going on alongside a cloud migration, program. Is the data security program competing with the cloud migration program? Is there a new ERP system being, rolled out at the same time? When you get to the scale of large enterprises where you have multiple lines of business that actually have, to some extent, duplicate functions, some each with their own CISOs even, and you have the hub and spoke model of a security organization and then different lines of business, things really need to be organize well from the start because of the complexity involved across, those thousands of servers and databases and hundreds of people.
Yeah, and then you're going to also have like a ton of vendors that you're working with from like, third party services. Like it's not like you're just going to have Salesforce running. You're going to have probably like you could have thousands of essentially applications that need to be, vetted from a security perspective, probably connected into potentially your customer data. The just like even starting to think about that from like a privacy and security perspective, it gets a little scary just to even start to wrap your head around it.
Totally. You've got vendors that also do the same things in the security space outside of their actual, what you're hiring the vendor for, right? So if I put on my customer hat, I've got a, particular vendor A that has all this great governance stuff, that they can offer to lock down the data that lives within their world. And somewhere else, that vendor A could be selling elsewhere within the enterprise. Could be the same vendor, right? And different stakeholders are applying different governance rules elsewhere within the business. Oh, and then by the way, you have your central security organization that might have something like a sale point, which is intended to orchestrate the governance across all of these applications. So should you be configuring, data security at each endpoint? Should you do it only centrally? How can you shift left? These are all, questions that folks should be asking when considering any project, especially one that takes all of your customer data and does analytics on it, or any exposure to privacy and risk in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these companies are, aren't necessarily born in the cloud. They might have been around for a long time as well. So they're probably running, potentially they're running on-prem or hybrid cloud system as well, trying to, maybe they're trying to modernize and migrate. You mentioned migration to the cloud earlier. That further adds to the complexity and, just thinking from like a governance standpoint, all the places that you might need to control access to information, both from in a hybrid cloud system. Like, what are some of the things that you've seen in terms of those setups that are both, I guess, like a little bit scary, and then also like how are teams or companies thinking about actually managing that today?
Yeah. So, some of the risks involved, and some of them are scary, are, the benefits of the cloud are, cost optimization. You don't have to run your own data center anymore. A lot of different tools and even security functionality that the, AWSs of the world and the GCPs and Azures can provide you for that space. It's very attractive, but the how you get to the cloud is often, an afterthought after the deal has been inked and it's like, okay, get to the cloud, right? So what's scary for me is when you're in a hybrid cloud setup. When you're fully on-prem, you've got a set of controls, right? Those controls have been there since, the beginning of on-prem data centers. When you take your first step into the cloud and start putting customer data there, now you've got those sets of controls that need to be extended to a cloud world. Oftentimes that can slow down a project. And my view on this is you can think about it as a data foundation set of policies. And if you really think about the cloud as an application, that is an application that you can have your data flow into, and securing it at the data level, at the foundation, actually is kind of allows you to be as left as possible so that what's flowing through into that new cloud world could be secured.
Yeah, I would think as well, like in the hybrid world, you almost end up having to like there's different skill set in terms like from a security perspective, right? Like you might need somebody that is has more knowledge and like specialized knowledge around AWS or GCP or like wherever you're running, or even if you're running multi-cloud, then you need that knowledge plus whatever you did in the on-prem world as well. So you kind of have you're living in like a foot in one part of the world and a foot in another part of the world and trying to maintain consistency across both of those, plus the skill sets needed and required to actually manage those and protect them and lock everything down.
Totally. There are new companies founded on, solving for that risk and complexity, right? Like cloud management tools that support multi-cloud so that you're looking at one interface, behind which you see your Azure stuff, you see your GCP stuff, you see your AWS stuff. Multi-cloud is only recently being scaled up in the enterprise space. A lot of enterprise companies don't want to put all of their eggs in one basket, even if it's a huge global cloud basket. So that's maybe something that's coming in the future for large enterprises. And again, those same people and those same security controls need to then extend into that multi-cloud world. There's a lot to solve for there.
What do you see as some of the like initial workloads that like large enterprises are moving to the cloud as sort of the first step to maybe running a more modern system?
Yeah. So, I mean, no company will put customer data into the cloud without having some kind of assurance that it's secure, right? So if you're a large enterprise that maybe is dabbling in the cloud, or you have some non-critical workloads in the cloud, oftentimes that's where you start. You start with something that's not to say not vital, but if something were to go wrong, you've only dipped your toe in, so you can kind of correct as you go. So I would say the first step is to get started in the cloud, figure out what either set of applications you can migrate there. When you think about moving from on-prem data warehouses to something like a Snowflake, now you're talking about cloud services that are themselves built on top of the cloud, and that could be I would say a shortcut out of managing your own cloud versus getting the services that you need out of the cloud. That's another space that's growing.
I would think so. You mentioned like Snowflake there. So now, especially with this, all the hype around generative AI and LLMs, there's probably a lot of companies that are trying to make investments there. They want to move some of their data over to Databricks, Snowflake, whatever it is, essentially whatever warehouse lake product that they feel like using. How do you see these organizations sort of ensuring, confidentiality, integrity, availability of these types of environments as they're sort of shifting? Because they probably want to base some of the training of whatever their investment is in Gen AI on some of their, customer data or private information. So how are they sort of thinking about navigating that? Or what are you seeing, or what have you seen before?
Absolutely. I mean, compute is cheap, storage is cheap now. So there's no more built-in friction to moving all of your data, every customer and everything you know about your customer into this one application so that you can run all the analytics on it, right? So I would say you need to protect the data where it is, right? I think in past times where there was some friction to actually accomplishing some of this, and compute was a little bit more expensive, you could have specific projects on use cases where you want to actually shift data over. But with the LLM space and with apps like Snowflake, who can do this at scale, and Databricks, you really need to secure the data first in a way that is interoperable with these systems, right? So when we start to think about the cloud journey and all of these all these applications living in the cloud, you need something that probably is already in the cloud. You need something that is API based, since most of these applications are themselves API based and can speak that language. And then, of course, there are open standards for compliance controls that already exist from the on-prem world. When we talk about the digital identity world, things like SAML and OpenID Connect for authenticating and making sure that you can map your users into those spaces. If you secure all of your data and put it in Snowflake, but all of your company has access to all of that data because you really didn't string up your roles right, then is it really secure? So there are a lot of things to consider as you're going on that journey.
You mentioned compliance there. So in terms of compliance, like what are some of the main regulatory frameworks that large enterprises are must navigate, or what is sort of keeps them up at night in terms of compliance, and how do these impact their data management strategies?
Totally. I mean, you've got the EU's GDPR. You have now specific states and countries making regulations. California has CCPA, India has DPDP, Saudi Arabia, Australia. These data regulation policy frameworks are only getting more numerous, right? So solving for one at a time, isn't feasible anymore. In fact, the space for a service in and of itself to to handle that for you the way that, old school databases offered encryption at rest, right? There are services now that can offer data residency, out of the box, that can offer this in a way that actually allows you to avoid replicating your entire infrastructure stack for the next regulation that comes in. If you're a large multinational corporation and you have customers everywhere, the EU needs you to keep their data in the EU, right? There are restrictions in California. You need to think for the future where you will need a fast way to adhere to all these different policies. I'm not an expert on them, but at Skyflow, I can defer to Robin, our chief privacy officer, for all of those questions where I have gaps. But this is definitely something that customers need to think about solving for ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that if you're a global company, just we're talking about privacy and security, just even in the hybrid model, but then you start to factor in things like data residency, other regulatory requirements, but it starts to get we keep talking complex is the word of the day, but it starts to get really complicated where you could be having to essentially house customer data in 10 different regions around the world, and then how do you manage that? How do you run global analytics workloads, that sort of stuff? So what are some of the strategies that you're seeing from companies that have been able to do this successfully?
Yeah, so I mean, I think about it in kind of 3 steps, right? Like cast a wide net on what you're trying to solve, right? So, something like I want to secure, and it's going to sound vague, right? Like I want to secure all of my customers' data, no matter where they live, no matter what regulation happens in the future, and I want to do this at scale in a cost-effective way, right? That there might be a few more checkboxes that I'm missing there, but that would be a huge feat, right? So cast a wide net on what you're trying to do, and then chunk it up and build a phased approach, right? Your first phase could be vendor selection, right? Often is. But your first phase of implementation after vendor selection could be getting, data into the platform, ensuring that you can hook it up to one of your big data solutions, like I mentioned, Snowflake or Databricks, and then leverage open standards in both that vendor selection and how you go about your implementation. When you're working as a platform team for data analytics, figure out within the organization, within the enterprise, ping the CISO. Hey, I heard Skyflow has this governance solution. What are we doing for governance? You'll probably hear, oh, we've got Okta, we've got SailPoint, we've got Ping. Let me connect you with someone to plug into the open standards. A lot of times in large enterprises, the organizational drift between who's implementing the project and the security world is a bridge that needs to be, or a gap that needs to be bridged in order to be successful here. Just one customer example, a recent customer of mine, we were able to accomplish, the casting the wide net and the phased approach. And we got them, live in, I think it was 26 business days, right? And this is a large health tech company that has data in, their customers are global. They had to adhere to a number of standards. So our first phase was getting all of their data and tokenizing it, encrypting it at rest, and also taking in any tokens they had from a previous vendor that they were moving off of, right? So that was the first phase, swap out like for like, make sure that everything works. And then the next phase is going to be expanding into de-identification use cases, right? After X number of years, we don't want that data to be de-tokenized, right? So now we've got a security layer on top of a security layer that we're enabling, and that's expected to be done by the end of this month, so about a month overall. So after that, right, phase 3, we're thinking about securing that data as it flows in and out of Snowflake, in and out of Salesforce, right? Solving this and aiming big with a wide net at the data layer foundation allows you to then, check off those boxes in all of your business use cases.
Yeah, I think a big part of this is this is true of any company, but especially, in a large organization where things just get so complicated, even just from knowing what different teams are doing, like you mentioned, the idea of hey, ping your CISO if you want to find out what are you doing from a governance standpoint, right? And it's easy to not even have awareness of what different teams are doing and how they're solving different problems, or what the company standard is if you're in a company with tens of thousands of people. I mean, when I joined Google, they had 75,000 full-time employees. And when I left, there was 150,000 full-time employees. Like that's a lot of people. I mean, to navigate and a lot of teams, thousands of products to like really understand what's going on. So they need certain processes put in place to do that. But from a vendor selection standpoint, I think you need to be thinking about what is the longevity of this product solution? Like, am I potentially shooting myself in the foot a little bit by doing something where I'm putting sort of a Band-Aid on the problem today that doesn't scale and grow with my business? Or, if you're specifically looking at privacy landscape, doesn't scale and grow with the ever-changing landscape that is privacy regulations around the world.
Totally. And, I'm not someone who's going to say that, you can fully future-proof, based on, any kind of RFP criteria or vendor selection process, but you should have that wide net so the dimensions across which you should be trying to future-proof, right? So to me, it comes down to interoperability with all of the other systems in different teams, because folks on those teams are actually doing the same process where they are trying to future-proof their own solutions for their own use cases, right? So as long as you're keeping your house in order and making sure that you're interoperable with the main, again, CISO organization or other lines of business with which you're exchanging data, then you can all kind of rise up together. Otherwise you end up in a project that never starts and never finishes, right? Because you can't get through the requirements. You do actually want to start, and that's why you want to front load with a phased approach that gets you a quick time to value while also having a long tail on the value you can achieve.
So besides some of the challenges just around, like, there's a lot of people involved and there could be a lot of products involved, are there other unique challenges that large enterprises face in terms of trying to securely manage like customer and employee data that may not be something that a smaller company faces?
Totally. So if you think about the scale of a small business and startup to like a medium tier business to the Fortune 500 large enterprise, you can kind of filter it through the common like people process technology lens. Not to show my consulting experience too much here, but when you're working with a startup or a small business, the development team might be the executive team, right? The CTO could be the one working on, their greenfield application and incorporating, the APIs needed to secure the customer data, right? As far as process goes, you might have, one customer sign up, ingress point, and then maybe one egress point where you're showing the customer data somewhere or doing some small analytics. And as far as the technology goes, it's nice working with startups because oftentimes there's, might not even be a product yet because they're still building and they're thinking about security first. When you move to medium size companies, you kind of start to see specialized teams form, right? You've got a data team or an analytics team. You have a team working on front end applications, maybe even a server side team, right? And then you almost always have a security team tasked with making sure that, compliance and controls are implemented. As far as like process goes, you might have a couple of applications, you might have a couple of ingress points for customer data. Maybe you've released an app, maybe you've got also a website, you're growing as a company. And as far as technology goes, when you think about the data flow, maybe now you have an ETL pipeline, right? It's probably an ETL pipeline that, looks nice and pretty where you've got some entry points and a data warehouse here, and then your analytics tool here. When you get to large enterprise, all of that gets blown up because a large enterprise was a medium-sized enterprise at some point and was a small business at some other point. And there's no point along which they've, thrown everything out and started over, right? It's not like you get to do a greenfield when you become a large enterprise, whatever the definition of that is. So again, right, with people, you've got semi-autonomous lines of business that can act almost as separate companies in and of themselves. You've got that hub and spoke model of security where, organizationally bridging those gaps is actually quite difficult. And you've got so many ingress and egress points for that data that it's not uncommon for large enterprises to not know where all of a customer's data is, which presents big challenges for, that pretty delete me and delete all my info button that some of the regulatory bodies now require large enterprises to have. And again, the technology side, each tool along the way, your pretty ETL pipeline, it now looks like a tree with multiple branch nodes. Each node is a different vendor's application or custom app that has its own controls, its own way to do this, and keeping all of that kind of in line so that you're compliant, but not only compliant, you're keeping the trust of your customers is very difficult.
Yeah, I talked to a business last year based in Europe that they estimated they had 8,000 databases. And so that's just the databases. So it's not even, the log files, backups, all that sort of stuff. I'm not sure if they were including like warehousing in their 8,000 or not, but there's a lot of places to try to keep track of customer data. One of the other things you talked about too there that I think is interesting is these companies have gone through presumably like an evolution. Like they've gone from small company to, mid-sized enterprise to enterprise company over whatever the lifetime of that company is. And they're kind of, they're taking along a certain amount of like technical debt along that way as well. And they can't essentially just, rip and replace things every time they reach some, new scale goal or something. So they basically have to have all those systems that they're sort of continually supporting. And that adds to the complexity of potentially like, modernizing or having to maintain like old systems and old processes. And I think a lot of this comes down to being able to do this successfully is around sort of how do you like operationalize all this sort of stuff? Like what sort of checks and balances do you have for launching a new product and so forth? So what are some of the things that you've seen that companies are doing that allows them to like effectively manage sort of this, juggernaut in terms of, launching new products or making new investments in technologies in a way that doesn't lead to, a massive data breach?
Yeah, I think it's not simple, but straightforward. If you, at the end of the day, what you're concerned about is a breach of your customer's data, then the straight line to that would be securing your customer's data. Obviously, Sam, right? Well, what I mean by that is there are many different ways that you can apply controls on top of controls on top of controls that if you follow all of the breadcrumbs back home, you are securing your customer's data. But something standard like, okay, obviously you want to encrypt all of your customers' data in rest, in transit, secure protocols and things like that. But without sacrificing, I'll say business value, for example, right? In the customer service example where you need to prevent fraud by having your frontline customer service folks validate social security numbers or addresses or any number of factors there. Do you allow your customer service folks to have access to the data for any customer that could call in? On one hand, yes, because any customer could call in. On the other hand, they don't need access to all of that data all the time, right? I think so many of the recent breaches are social engineering as their entry point, right? So you social engineer, you may be a frontline customer service worker who's taken some security training, right? And should know what to do, but maybe just has access to more than what they should. The principle of least privilege is that you only need access to, or you should only have access to what you need at the time you need it, right? So I would say protecting your data in a way that enables and maintains that business value by following those principles is one approach you can do. And now there are vendors in the space that by that combination of data security and interoperability are providing that straight line to that security.
Yeah, I think a great example of this, and I recommend anybody listening that's interested in this topic, is to check out this blog post that Retool put up probably about a month ago now that talks about the data breach that they had. And the attacker used very sophisticated, like a combination of social engineering. They deep faked their audio to sound like an employee. They knew the layout of the actual Retool office, like all this sort of stuff, like exploiting some issues with Google Authenticator and the fact that Retool is moving to Okta. There was so much going on into attacking this company, but ultimately what ended up happening was the sort of scale of what that person was able to get to. They got into like 27 accounts, which is, of course not ideal, but that's a lot better than 27,000 accounts. And the reason they were able to limit the scale of that attack so much was because they combined a lot of these best practices in security of like zero trust, principles of least privilege, using like essentially like single tenant environments for all their enterprise accounts. So it wasn't like you compromise one place and you just got access to the keys to the kingdom or anything like that. They had to essentially break down each wall of every individual account, and they didn't get very far.
Yeah, that's a great example, right? I mean, and with generative AI, the social engineering attacks are just going to get more complex. I think if I get a phone call and it sounds like my mom, and she's in trouble, am I gonna ask her to send me a authenticator code or something like that? Yeah. So yeah, I think the human side of this is not solvable, nor do I think it necessarily should aim to be solved by that means alone, right? Training is great. We should be aware of all of these threats, especially folks who have access to data. But solving the problem as close to the data as possible I think, has to be the starting point now that, businesses are moving so fast into new industries, right? LLM stuff and generative AI, you can't have a 2-year project to get into a space like that, or else you're already behind, right? How do you do it securely?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, that was an area that I kind of wanted to touch on. Like, how do you think that the adoption of AI, machine learning is going to impact data security and privacy practices in large organizations? And I guess like what precautions should companies be, starting to implement when you mentioned the fact that like someone could potentially deepfake your mom's voice, or even less sophisticated than that. I think a lot of like phishing attacks that happen over email or text message, to anybody who's like even remotely knowledgeable, a lot of times they're laughable in terms of like the way they're written and stuff like that. But now if you can go to ChatGPT and actually generate something that at least is, written in English and looks like it could potentially be from a friend, then suddenly you're probably going to trick a lot more people.
Totally. I mean, gone are the days where you just have to look for typos in the email to see if it's a phishing attack or something, right? So, I think when you think about the entry of LLMs, whether it's public with OpenAI and ChatGPT, or even companies spinning up their own private LLMs, you really need a firewall type of technology between the data that you want to extract analytics from, you want to pass through to the LLM, and the LLM itself, right? And this says nothing of intra-company compliance controls. In the banking and investment space, there's some customer data, for example, maybe in commercial real estate line of business, that the investment arm of the bank absolutely cannot see, right? So, if all of this data is going into the same LLM, that customer data is being used for training. You can't really guarantee, and in fact, you should expect that those models are then spitting out results that could basically have input from that data. So how can you actually communicate with these LLMs without passing in the fact that my name is Sam, right? Is the fact that my name is Sam important to what I want from the LLM? Or, can you actually leverage, technologies like tokenization to tokenize on the way out, on the way to the LLM, all of the sensitive data, whether it's PII, PHI, or even company, trademarks or secrets, and tokenize that prior to the point that the LLM gets the data. Your analytics are still generated and returned to you. And then your layer in between, your protection layer, detokenizes so that, your customer service, representative or your analytics admin actually sees the data that they want to see with the PII as authorized, without having ever sent that data to the LLM.
Yeah, I think, it kind of goes back to the point you were making earlier about a company, migrating their customer data into Snowflake or something like that. And, if they don't essentially connect their whatever they're using for an identity platform to the roles and permissions within Snowflake, they could potentially be giving all their employees essentially access to like all their customer data, which would not be ideal. And you have the same essentially situation that's even potentially more complex in the world of LLMs if you're using, company data, proprietary data, internal documents, whatever it is, employee data, customer data, to train your LLMs and perform inference and so forth. Like you need to be thinking through, I said, how do you control who sees what, when and where for all these different systems that you're connecting up. And I think one of the things that is a little bit different in the enterprise too, that we haven't really touched on when it comes to violations from a compliance standpoint or data breaches, just the visibility of these companies too is significantly bigger than, if you're a smaller company. Like obviously like a data breach data leak is not ideal for anybody, but if you're a big publicly traded company, you're more of a target, and the impact from a customer trust standpoint could be massively, negative for your company if you essentially suffer one of these breaches or something like that. You're going to be in the news. You're going to be a little embarrassing, and you're going to lose a lot of customer trust.
Totally. And when you do your retro on that, was there a decision made where you had to choose between a business initiative or thoroughly vetting a solution for more security compliance? Right. I'm a little bit idealistic in my career, but I've always tried to, recommend to whether it was clients or customers or even colleagues that, why can't we have our cake and eat it too? Right. Now we have technologies like, format preserving encryption and format preserving tokenization where, at the data layer, you can tokenize your data, have your applications reading that same data without needing to change those schemas. Right. And if you do this, right, in theory, I wouldn't recommend it, but you wouldn't even have to notify those lines of business that anything was changing. Nothing would break. Some processes might break in that the data that would be coming out of the analytics tools would, 4,716 is not a valid year, right? So if you're tokenizing and using format preserving encryption on that, you would see some skewed data, but there are technologies now that allow you to move fast, maintaining your competitive edge while also increasing security.
Yeah, you actually see that in the I believe it was Capital One data breach that happened recently, where the only fines they actually got was for the data that was encrypted and not actually tokenized. So I think that was a relatively small amount of data compared to the total amount of data that they had. But for some reason, some small subset of their data was only encrypted at rest. And then essentially the encryption keys got compromised as part of that breach, which means that they could be decrypted and suddenly that information could be compromised. But everything that had been tokenized was essentially de-identified and couldn't be re-identified.
Totally, right. And when you think about, Capital One actually is a good example of they had some protection, right? It could have been so much worse.
Right.
But when you think about, starting something like this, not necessarily from scratch, but as a large enterprise, can you bring your own keys and tie into the process you already have for key rotation, right? If you already have tokenization solutions, can you bring your own tokens, right? Interoperability, I think, allows you to draw a line from the controls you already have and are working to that new business initiative, whether it's LLMs or generative AI or anything else, and map the security into the new world, right?
What about, so one of the concerns I've seen when I've talked to different companies, especially large companies at a conference or something like that, is they want to know about performance. So sure, there's all these great, newfangled privacy enhancing technologies that allow me to, sort of have my cake and eat it too. But, what does that do to my systems from a performance standpoint? Because presumably, I might be serving millions or if not billions of customers. So if I suddenly am adding additional layers of security in there, is it going to be sort of the juice worth the squeeze? Is it going to kill my business because suddenly I'm adding all these layers that really slow down and add additional latency?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Enterprises do not have, cannot bear additional latency in between critical processes, sometimes real-time processes. When you talk about ETL jobs and batch jobs, like that's maybe that there are smaller performance requirements there, but even those you don't want to have increased latency. So when you think about adding something like tokenization, where now every time you need the plain text data in an authorized use case, in an authorized fashion, you need to be able to scale to multiple thousands of requests per second. the same customer example that I mentioned earlier, I think we were able to get them upwards of 10 to 20,000 requests per second, not per minute or hour, per second, right? So that really helped their workloads complete when they needed them to, including their real-time use cases, without adding much additional latency at all, right? So I think a good detokenization, now I think with Skyflow we're below 10 milliseconds for our beefiest kind of single tenant solution. But you really can't sacrifice performance because that's a tax on everything, right? The customer service worker who has someone on the phone, they're waiting for their system to detokenize their now tokenized social security number. The customer might notice that, right? These are latency is a hidden tax on the entire business, right? And it can lead to a soured customer experience, even if it's kind of behind a daisy chain set of internal processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things too is you have to think through where you actually use this data. I think like a lot of times, because we're used to potentially building systems where we have access to the PII, in a database or something like that whenever we want, or we can sort of decrypt it on the fly within the server that where we're processing it, that we kind of convince ourselves that we need access to the data at any given point. But most of the time when we're talking about like passing data through internal systems, we don't actually need access to the PII. You need it at render time, essentially, which is, maybe serving just one user or serving, an analyst in like a reporting scenario through like their Snowflake instance or something like that. So it actually, the scope of where you actually need to perform something like a detokenization is relatively small compared to the entire lifecycle of the data itself.
Totally, right? And there's, in large enterprises, the amount of tech debt that is related to, maybe plain text data in a certain internal log, but not many people have access to that log, so it's not going to jump to the top of our priority list. Things like that, grow to become, folks might now rely on those logs to troubleshoot things, and now the tech debt has turned into something that is, quote unquote, needed to actually perform work elsewhere, right? You really need to, again, idealistic Sam here, right? Figure out how to, shift as left as possible, secure your data first in a way, right, that allows you to confirm that your core business cases are not impacted. Make sure all those stakeholders are brought in, and then all of the stuff in between, right? You now know that there'll be tokenized stuff in the logs. You'll have to just see who screams, right? That maybe is not a great answer here, but when you want to achieve large scale, change with respect to increased security, someone screaming isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You want to know who's screaming and why, and change course as needed. But in that log example, right, that Sam's mom's name shouldn't have been in that log in the first place, right? So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, that reminds me of one of the projects I worked on, or one of the products I worked on at Google, API-based product, and people would register essentially like a company bot, and the unique identifier for the company bot originally would be the name of the company with some sort of random string essentially at the end of it. I think even before, originally it was just the company's name as a slug basically, and which would lead to like collisions, and then we had to add some random string on it. And a big part of that was because when the engineers looked through log files, they wanted a shortcut to be able to identify which company it was associated with. So it wasn't necessarily PII. Eventually, we moved away from that to using essentially like a non-company related identifier that was just like a random value. But those are the kinds of things that people end up building, is because this is convenient for me in this moment. It could be a lot worse than that, where you're logging something that's like far more, potentially risky to your customer or something like that. But these are the conveniences. We think that we need them. And then it's like some system that no one's paying attention to for a decade. And then until someone like figures it out and exploits it in some way, and it leads to, some nasty press coverage for the company.
Totally. Something as small as a naming convention could make the news.
Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, are there emerging trends and technologies that you see, outside of AI having significant impact from, data security and privacy standpoint for some of these, large companies in the future?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said outside of AI because that's kind of the easy answer.
Yeah, I have to caveat that because like everyone's only ever talking about AI. So
Yeah, totally. So, I would say multi-cloud actually. So I am now old enough to have been through a physical to virtual server migration where, my team had a set of servers in a actual room that you would have to go and turn on with a button, right? And moving those into, I think it was VMware at the time, where you had a racked server that had a set of virtual servers there, going through those migrations, and then moving from, kind of virtual servers, but still on-prem into hybrid cloud and having large organizations dip their foot into the cloud. Now, a lot of the companies that have made their way into the cloud and maybe even don't have any more on-prem are now thinking about cost optimization and again, not putting every egg in the same basket. So how do you actually maintain security in a multi-cloud environment, right? Is it in the identity world, something like an Okta where your authentication is actually centralized because that is some say the strongest control in terms of the identity space in terms of user security. How do you do that with your data, right? So, whether it's AWS S3 or, Azure's version or GCP's version, what are the controls upon which you need to secure your data in a multi-cloud world? And yeah, I think multi-cloud for large enterprise is only now starting to really take steam, but it does seem to be moving in that direction for a lot of large enterprises.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you've kind of flagged that because it's something I'm also sort of I feel like has been on my radar more recently as well. And it's something that, if you're a smaller company, it's probably unlikely that you need a very good reason to be essentially running workloads on both, AWS and Azure and GCP or something like that, just because it's just unnecessary management overhead. It might be premature sort of cost optimization. But if you're a large enterprise, you want to have that negotiation power with those different cloud providers and have them sort of like, hey, like move this workload over here and we'll cut it will cut down the price and so forth, as well as, there's certain protection and there's also certain features of the, resources available on different clouds that may be better to run certain types of systems on. So you need to kind of think about, you mentioned identity, like how are we going to manage identity across these? How are we going to manage customer data across these, in a multi-cloud environment? And of course, even the hybrid cloud environment as well. So those things are, I think, unique to the large enterprise.
Absolutely.
Well, Sam, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed this. I think people will enjoy this as well. And is there anything else you'd like to share or add as we start to wrap up?
Yeah. I think if there's one more thing I'd like to share, perhaps the thing that matters, I won't say the most, but among the most important is, the team and the partners that you actually put together to achieve something as great as securing all of your customers' data. It is a lofty goal. That's probably the thing that needs to be there more than anything else, right? You need to have the right vendors that are providing the right support for what you're doing to secure your company's data. You got to have the right folks within your own team, line of business, your security org, the right stakeholders involved. You need to know as much as possible beforehand which questions to ask, where the band-aids are, right? Where someone's mother's name is in a log file, right? You want to try to get ahead of all of that so you can solve for it or at least prioritize it, right? So that's the one thing, last thing I'd probably share is that this is still very much a people problem and can be solved by, a team that consists of the right people, with a common goal.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think that's something that's been, aligned with some, previous conversations that we've had on the podcast is this theme around, privacy and security. It really needs to be part of the culture of a company to do right, because ultimately it does come down to a people problem. Like people need to be sort of thinking about this from first principles and also be conscious of it with each thing, whether it's buying a product that they're going to, incorporate as a vendor, or whether it's, building and developing new products and they need to collect customer data, and thinking about how do I securely handle this? How is my company solving these types of problems? So I think that's a really great place to leave it. And I want to thank you again for so much for coming on, and cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, Sean.